The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. I'm about to start my senior year of college. Last semester, I took a job as a desk attendant at my school's library. It's a private university, so they get away with paying their workers below minimum wage, but I don't mind. So long as I make enough to be able to afford my gas, I'm in the clear. I commute about an hour back and forth from home to school every day of the week, so a little gas money goes a long way. The cool thing about the library job is that it doesn't require much from me. I sit at a desk and check books in and out, answer the occasional phone call, and help wherever needed. I have a lot of downtime and spend most of it reading or catching up on homework. Hours are a little sporadic though. My schedule usually looks something like this: Tuesday 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m, Thursday 4:30 p.m. to 10. The library closes at 10. I spend many of those hours doing nothing at all, really. Being in the library for so long with nothing to do, you begin to take notice of certain things, like when the library is most active and when there's no one in there at all. It's fairly active towards the start of my shift around 4:30 and dies down from about 5:30 to 7. From 7 to 9, there's usually a good deal of traffic in and out. More often than not, though, I spend that last hour from 9 to 10 completely alone there. Those nights when I'm there until close, I'm responsible for shutting the lights off and locking the room downstairs that houses the library's book collection. I'm never down there during the day. Most of the textbook students need to check out are kept upstairs and are never more than a few steps away from my desk. Locking that room is the last thing I do before I go home for the night. I took this job because I wanted something on campus where I could walk straight from class to work. The last thing I want to do is leave school and have to drive somewhere else to go do more work. So having that job right there on campus was ideal. It is incredibly mundane, but I get to see a lot of faces. It's nice to know that people on campus don't just see me as that weird guy in their economics class, but rather that guy in the library. Like I said, from about 9 to 10, it's pretty quiet in there. Most of the other lights in the building are usually already turned off before I even leave. One night when I went to lock up the room downstairs, I thought I heard something coming from one of the back corners. I called out, asking if anyone was down there, and when no one replied, I shut the lights off, waited a beat to see if someone yelled out, "Hey, I'm down here," or something. But when no one did, I locked the door and closed it behind me. I didn't dwell on it at all. In fact, I put the whole thing completely out of my mind almost immediately. I only remembered it again after what happened to me recently. Another great thing about this library job is that it continues into the summer. My friends hound me endlessly about staying on for the summer. "Why don't you just get a job in town?" they say. Something that's not an hour away and pays better. I don't want a different job, though. I like working there. I like being on campus when no one else is. There's a strange feeling to it, but it's one I like. It makes me feel like a true staff member there and not just some student worker. The job is different over the summer, though. Since there's no students coming in to check out books, there's really no need to just sit at the desk upstairs. Lots of other libraries request books from us. So the first part of my workday involves packaging up those books for shipment. It's a long, complicated process, and it usually takes most of the morning. Once that is done, however, the summer project has been to go down to the book collection and make sure all the books are still there. There's a huge list, all on an Excel spreadsheet, every book in the entire library. And my job is to go through and check every single one to make sure that it's there and catalogued properly. If a book isn't there, I type an X next to it in the Excel sheet and move on. Lots of books that are shelved aren't even on the list. Those books, I turn onto their spine and my boss comes through later and takes them out. I don't work alone though. There's another girl that works with me. We each take a section and start on either end, checking off books until we meet in the middle Once we're done, we move on to the next section and start the process again. The collection is large enough that oftentimes starting on either end of one section means that she and I are several shelves away from one another. Summer hours are different too. I work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Wednesdays and Fridays. I get Saturday through Monday off, which is pretty nice. One day, when work was about over, I came back upstairs from the collection and remarked casually to my boss that I found a book down there from the 1890s. She didn't seem as thrilled as me about the discovery. "Go wash your hands," she said. I was a little confused. "Why's that?" I asked. In books from before 1900, they used to use heavy metals like lead and mercury in the publishing process. I attended a conference a while back and they talked about that. I'm doing my best to take all of those books out and get rid of them. Go wash your hands. I went and washed my hands in the bathroom, and while I was in there, I couldn't help but realize the tragedy of what she had said. She was going to be getting rid of any old books she found. It's not that these books were all that interesting, usually some old treatise on bird watching or something like that. But still, old books are cool, poisonous or not, and I hated to see them going into the dump. Most days down in the book collection, it's my boss, my one co-worker, and myself. We often talk back and forth from across the room about strange books we find, calling out goofy titles and things of the like. I occasionally find an old book from the late 1800s and tell my boss. She snatches them up and puts them on her card. I hate seeing that, so I have taken to just not telling her about them. Summertime temperatures are in full swing, so most days it's about 90 degrees or so outside. Problem is, it's about 60 degrees down in that book collection room, so I always have on a sweater or something over my t-shirt. When I step outside to go to lunch, it's always incredibly too hot for all the clothes I have on. But if I didn't have them, I'd freeze to death down in that book collection. When my boss told me that my co-worker would be gone for the next 2 weeks, I didn't think much of it. It was an easy job, and all her absence meant was that it would just take a little longer to get through sections of books now. Lots of times I was down in that room by myself. My boss was often in her office or running various errands around campus. I always knew when she came back down there because I could hear her begin scanning books and putting them on her cart. Though I hardly ever saw her, I'd occasionally catch a glimpse of her between shelves of books. I always bring earbuds because without some kind of podcast or music playing, 4 hours or so in that collection would just drive me insane. I came into work the other day, 15 minutes late, 10 minutes later than usual, and noticed that my boss was not at her usual place behind her desk. I took my seat at my desk and saw a note stuck to the computer screen. "Good morning. I will be out of town today and tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. If you run into any issues with loans or anything, don't worry about it. We will figure it out next week. Have a great weekend." Reading this note, I honestly breathed a sigh of relief. Now I could slack off and not feel bad about it. It's not that I hate this job, but it's not exactly easy to lock in and work when all you are doing is reading call numbers on books and putting a little check mark or an X on a spreadsheet. I did my best to get all the loans taken care of for that day and immediately took advantage of my boss's absence. Anytime I want a drink when I'm working, I have to walk to a separate building nearby where there is a vending machine. It takes roughly 5 or 6 minutes to get from the library to the vending machine and back. That building with the vending machine is one of the oldest still standing on campus. Even in broad daylight, it gives me the creeps. I got a drink and took the long way back to the library. I was probably gone for about 10 minutes. I went down to the book collection, put my headphones in, and picked up from where I left off the day before. I was at the very back of the library, the farthest corner from the door. Back there, one of the overhead fluorescent lights is out, so it's oddly dark. Having just got back from that creepy old building, I was already somewhat spooked when I got back down to the book collection. Like I said, that room is always cold, but that day it felt even colder. I genuinely felt like my sweater and sweatpants were not enough to keep me warm. The longer I was down there, the more I wished I had a jacket, or a thicker sweater or something. I made the mistake of listening to a Creepypasta that day. This was a podcast I always listened to while working down there. But today, all alone, in that cold, poorly lit library, I realized that it was a mistake. I periodically took my headphones out because I swore I heard something. Each time I was proven to be incorrect, thankfully. I wondered for a while if the air conditioning in the building was broken or something. I could not think of any other reason why it was so cold in the book collection compared to the rest of the building, and especially outside. When I went out for lunch that day, I was genuinely shocked by the temperature discrepancy. I had to take my sweater off before I even got to my car. If you have ever been in a garage or an old basement in the winter, then you'd have a pretty good idea of what it felt like in that book collection. Getting back from lunch, I resumed my work. And yes, that same creepy podcast. As time ticked away down there, I suddenly got an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't see or hear anyone else down there, but I felt it strongly. I set my laptop down and walked around the room, checking every aisle of bookshelves. I looked through all of the windows to see if anyone might have been outside, but there was no one. I was still completely alone. I began to long for the workday to be over. I wanted to go home. I had gotten spooked, and at that point there was no getting unspooked. I checked my phone and saw that it was 3:00. I was relieved. Only 1 hour left. I went back to my work, but I soon became aware of some kind of sound. I pulled one of my earbuds out and listened. It was some kind of humming. I couldn't tell if it was from a machine or from a person. That collection room of the library contains a lot of doors that are always locked, with little signs that say things like boiler room or mechanical room. I figured this humming, which I had not heard at all this summer, must be coming from one of those rooms, but even still it didn't do my nerves any favors. I left my earbuds out, turned off my podcast, and decided to finish that last hour of work in silence. After all, I was getting sick of pulling an earbud out every 5 minutes or so to check for some strange sound. I heard a book fall. It was plain as day and unmistakable. Somewhere, several shelves away from me, a book just fell off of a shelf and hit the floor. That's got to be a pretty common thing in libraries though, right? I got up and looked for it. I saw it. It was one of those old books. It was so old that it wasn't even in English. I'm fairly certain that it was Latin. I picked up the book and put it back in place. I realized while reshelving it that it came from a very tightly packed shelf. I honestly had trouble squeezing it back into its place. Why would that book have fallen? It was almost like someone had tried to pick it off the shelf, dropped it, and ran away. But I knew that couldn't be what happened, because I would have heard all of that. But I didn't. All I heard was that book hitting the floor. I checked my phone and saw that it was only 3:07. How had only 7 minutes passed? I decided that I was done anyway. I needed to get out of that room. I was freezing, and I was scared. I shut my laptop and left. I hit the lights on my way out, and I know I heard another book fall before I closed the door. But I was not going to stick around to put it back. The whole drive home I thought of how ridiculous I was being. A book fell in a library. Big whoop. That's possibly the most normal thing that could happen in a library. I figured that I had just gotten spooked and had overreacted to everything. Fear has a way of heightening your senses. That must have been why I could hear every little noise in that library all day. I wondered if that humming I heard was something that is always going on, or something that kicks on periodically, and I just have never noticed before. By the time I got back home, I was laughing at myself for how paranoid I had been. I woke up late the next day. It was raining. Rolls of thunder kept me from getting up. It was so nice, so peaceful. When I actually looked at my phone and saw the time, that cloud of serenity dissipated. I jumped out of bed and quickly got dressed, rushed to my car, and sped out of my driveway. Halfway to the school, I realized that there was no reason for all this hurry. No one was there at work. When I arrived, I could be sure that I would be alone. A sinking feeling crept into my stomach at that realization. I thought of the day before. I was scared of my mind wandering again, elevating every little thing I heard or noticed. My fear was not of the library, but of what my own imagination would do to me while I was down there. I did not want it to happen again. I figured the more I thought about it, the more my imagination would mess with me. So when I actually got into work, I put my earbuds in and turned on some music. Most of the other people that work on campus must have had the day off that day, because it really felt like I was the only human being on the entire campus that day. It was so bad that I checked my schedule a few times just to make sure that I was in fact supposed to work that day. I was There was no mistake there. There were other cars in the parking lots, and some parked along the streets near the campus, but I really did not see anyone. I began the typical morning shtick, checking for loan requests and all that. There were none that day. That meant I had nothing more to do that day, other than go down to that collection room and start checking books. The room loomed over my mind. My imagination had begun to have its way with it, but I quickly pulled myself back together. It's an old room in an old library. Of course it's going to be creepy. Of course the central air isn't going to work right down there. Books fall off of shelves. That just happens. It is fine. Get over it, I said to myself as I slowly crept down the stairs. I reached the final step and turned to look down the short hallway to the collection room door. It was still shut, just like I left it. I slowly walked over to it and opened the door. I had forgotten to shut one light off. There was a single fluorescent light panel illuminating a small part of the collection room. It was closer to the back of the room, surrounded on all sides by darkness. Simple and explainable, but there was just something about it. The sound the light made, the darkness surrounding it, the dull yellowish nature of the light itself. My stomach sank immediately. I debated turning back right then, but instead chose to stay. I flicked the other light switches and the rest of the lights came on. It wasn't so bad like that. The sinking feeling in my stomach went away. It was as cold down there as it ever was, though it felt colder as my clothes and hair had not yet dried from my rainy walk from my car to the library. The clouds were dark enough that not much natural light got through the windows of that room. This left the corners dark and made the light feel unnatural. The upbeat music playing in my earbuds did only a passingly decent job at keeping my imagination from running wild. A few times, like the day before, I thought I heard something. At some point I remembered the book that had fallen before I closed up the day before. I wondered where that was, and went looking for it. I walked between the shelves searching for the book. I never found it. I had heard a book fall right. The sinking feeling came back a little bit. I returned to where I was, towards the back most part of the room, wary and growing increasingly more nervous. I felt as though the room was getting incrementally colder as the day went on. At one point I swear I saw my own breath. Suddenly my hair stood up on the back of my neck. I looked up from my laptop. I peeked through the shelves. Something was watching me and I knew it. I pulled my earbuds out and held perfectly still. I heard that same humming that I heard the day before. It seemed louder this time. I stepped away from my place in the shelves once again and began to walk down the aisles between the shelves. The humming did not seem like it was coming from one of those locked storage closets. Honestly, it didn't seem to have any source or point of origin at all. I found a strange spot on the ceiling in one of the aisles. I think that it was near the same shelf where the book had fallen. The spot looked like mold to me. It was black, but not faded or soaked in like how a lot of mold looks. It was dark black and almost shiny. It looked like someone had bought a paint can from Lowe's or Home Depot, opened the lid, and thrown it up at the ceiling. I understand that it must be mold or something, but I just don't think I've seen anything like it before. Another thing about that huge black spot. It was cold. Just standing below it, I felt like I was in a meat freezer. Perhaps just above that spot was where the central air was broken. I really don't know how that even works. Like maybe a pipe or tube was broken or ripped or something. Whatever it was, that explanation satisfied me enough. I walked back to the place where I was before and started working again. I found it incredibly hard to focus on my work. I wanted to leave. I was getting freaked out again, the same way I was yesterday. I was trying as hard as I could to keep my composure, not to become paranoid like I had before. I sat today on a stool staring straight ahead at the shelf of books in front of me. I wanted to ignore the feeling, but the longer I sat there, the harder it became. Something was looking at me. I could feel eyes on me. When I finally allowed the feeling to manifest fully, I felt paralyzed, as though whatever was looking at me could only sense motion or something. I heard a different sound, like the sound of something freezing or growing. It sounded like water soaking into a dry sponge. I seemed to perceive a dark shape hovering above me, but I couldn't bear to look up. I rationalized that a particularly dark rain cloud had passed close to the windows and blocked out even more of the Sunday. I heard a book fall again. I got up quickly. I grabbed my laptop and shut it. Tucking it under my arm, I walked around until I found the book. It was that same old book that had fallen before. I knelt down to pick it up. As I stretched out my hand to pick up the book, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. The hair on my neck stood straight. My skin tightened around my muscles and became covered in goosebumps. Without turning around, I stood and began to run. I hit a sharp right turn at the end of that row of shelves, and another just a few shelves from that. Then I had a straight and clear path for the door. I could hear it. Whatever it was. I heard footsteps behind me. Not running, but footsteps nevertheless. As I neared the door, I reached out to shut off the lights. I hit the switch, and just before shutting the door, I dared turn and look behind me. In the darkness, I thought I saw a shape. Something terrible. Something tall. Its other qualities I could only speculate, though overall it appeared human-like. I slammed the door shut and ran out to my car. The moment the door slammed shut, I heard the thing scream. I will never forget that sound. I haven't gone back to work there. I've ignored the emails from my boss, which I started getting the week after the incident. After a few weeks, the emails from her stopped. I dreaded returning to school. I did all I could to avoid setting foot in that library. If I ever do have to be in there, I avoid the bottom floor. And even on the other floors, I keep it brief. I figured I would get a chewing out from my boss if she ever saw me again. The first time I saw her, though, I did not see disdain or anger in her eyes. What I saw was understanding, trauma, as though she knew why I had left and never come back. We did not talk, but rather shared this look of understanding. After this, I ventured to open the emails which she had sent me. I found in the first email confusion as to why I had not gone into work that day. The next email from a day later had more anger to it. Then there was the third email. It simply said, "I understand." Towards the end of that fall semester, one cool October day, I arrived at school to find the library closed. I saw men in hazmat suits going in and out of the building. When I got glimpses inside, I could see plastic covering everything. They told the students that there was black mold discovered in the library, and that considerable efforts were required to clean up and dispose of the mold. They also told us that the librarian had taken a job at another school and would not be returning. I never believed it, and the fact that the library never reopened only confirmed what I had thought. I've put as much detail into this as I could possibly remember, just in case anyone here has ever encountered anything similar. I've thought about it and was wondering if black mold exposure causes hallucinations or something. I don't want to believe what I saw down there that day, but I'm haunted by the memories. Memories too vivid to pretend like they are from a dream. But maybe if someone else had a similar experience or knows exactly what I was encountering down there, then perhaps I could feel some kind of closure about this whole thing. Here's my story that I hadn't fully told everyone that I'm telling now, about my time working the night shift at Chuck E. Cheese's after the shooting. I used to work the night shift at Chuck E. Cheese's every day in December. The pay was decent, $10 an hour, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to tell you my story. The story of what happened after December 14th, 1993. That day was like any other, or so I thought. It was December 14th, 1993, when everything changed. Something terrible happened that night, something I'll never forget. There was a shooting that left 3 kids and 1 adult injured. The kids were all so young, 17, 19, and then there was Margaret, who was 50, not a kid, but still someone who didn't deserve what happened. I had to speak with law enforcement that night, recounting every detail of the scene, giving them my point of view. But after everything that happened that night, I was ready to quit. You see, I knew the man who did it, Nathan Dunlap. We used to work together. He was just 19, but he was like the rest of us, trying to make ends meet, clocking in and clocking out. He seemed normal, quiet, even. We didn't talk much, but when we did, there was nothing that stood out. He didn't seem like the type who would do something like this. That's what haunts me the most, how wrong I was. Nathan had been fired earlier that year, and I remember him being upset about it, but nothing more. I thought he'd moved on, found something else, but on that night, he came back. The restaurant was about to close, and there was this strange tension in the air. but I didn't pay it much mind. He walked in, just before closing, with a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. I didn't realize what it was until it was too late. He waited until the restaurant was empty, just us employees left, cleaning up like usual. That's when he pulled out a gun. My mind flouncy. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He started shooting Sylvia, Ben, Colleen, Margaret. They didn't stand a chance. He was methodical, cold. I'll never forget the sound. The chaos. I'll never forget the look on his face. I thought I knew him. I was wrong. Bobby was the only one who survived, but just barely. He played dead, and when Nathan wasn't looking, he managed to escape and call for help. But by then, it was too late for the others. Nathan stole money from the safe and left. He fled like nothing had happened, but something had happened. Something that left a stain on that place, on all of us. When the police caught him, he was almost calm, like he'd done what he came to do and it was over. He said it was revenge, but he was angry about being fired. But that explanation never made sense to me. It was more than that. Something darker. Something I'll never fully understand. I still see his face sometimes, hear his voice. I thought I knew him, but I was wrong. And that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. But that wasn't the strangest part of the story. No, that was just the beginning. I'm here to tell you what happened the night I worked the late shift at Chuck E. Cheese on December 15th. 1993, I was gonna quit. After everything that happened, I was ready to walk away, but they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. $30 an hour. They were desperate, and I needed the money, so I agreed to work one last time. What happened that night shook me to my very core. Driving down the road to Chuck E. Cheese's, I couldn't shake the haunting replay of the shooting from my mind. It was as if the images of that night were burned into my memory, looping endlessly. I was afraid, my nerves frayed, but the offer of $30 an hour was too tempting to ignore. As I pulled into the parking lot, the once familiar neon sign now felt cold and distant, its flickering lights casting a pale, ghostly glow over the empty space. The darkness seemed to swallow the building whole, leaving it eerily silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The sense of abandonment was almost palpable. I parked in my usual spot, the engine's hum fading into the stillness of the night. The quiet was unsettling, and I felt a chill despite the relatively mild weather. Stepping out of my car, I closed the door with a soft thud that felt unnaturally loud in the quiet. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking slightly as I walked toward the entrance. The restaurant's exterior lights were off, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to stretch and move with each step I took. The usual comforting glow of the Chuck E. Cheese's sign was replaced by a foreboding darkness. I approached the door, the metal handle cold under my grip. As I unlocked it, the faint creak of the hinges echoed ominously through the empty lot. The interior was a stark contrast to the bright, bustling place it had once been. The lights inside were off, and the vast space seemed cavernous and oppressive. I flicked on the lights, but they flickered uncertainly before settling into a dim, inadequate glow. The once cheerful decorations now seemed grim and out of place, their colors muted and shadows deepened by the feeble illumination. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, the hum of the ancient air conditioning system, the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe, and the soft scurrying of unseen creatures in the walls. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the eerie atmosphere made it clear this night would be anything but ordinary. Putting the keys into the lock, I turned it with a heavy feeling in my gut. As I pushed the door open, a chill ran down my spine. The building was shrouded in darkness, the dim light from the street lamps outside barely penetrating the interior. The once vibrant animal animatronics were now mere silhouettes in the gloom. Their outlines loomed large and distorted, their vacant eyes glinting ominously in the faint light. They had always creeped me out, their jerky, mechanical movements and the unnerving way they seemed to watch you, even when they were perfectly still. As I stepped inside, my footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space, amplifying the silence that surrounded me. The familiar, almost comforting noises of the restaurant were replaced by an unsettling quiet. The animatronic stationary forms seemed to cast long, twisted shadows across the floor, adding to the already eerie atmosphere. The sense of their watchful presence made the darkness feel even more oppressive. I walked briskly down the hallway toward the security office, eager to escape the oppressive darkness. The hall was dimly lit, and every step I took seemed to amplify the eerie silence around me. The security office was a small, windowless room tucked away from the main dining area. It was cluttered with old monitors and outdated equipment, giving it a somewhat disheveled and neglected appearance. The walls were adorned with a mix of peeling wallpaper and hastily taped up notices, some of which were reminders of past incidents and outdated safety protocols. A large metal desk dominated the room, its surface strewn with various papers, a few old coffee mugs, and a clutter of dusty cables. An old swivel chair, its faux leather cracked and worn, sat in front of the desk, facing the row of monitors that displayed the feeds from the restaurant's security cameras. The screens flickered intermittently, casting an eerie, stuttering glow across the room. The dim light from the monitors was the only source of illumination, creating long, shifting shadows that danced around the walls. The air was cool and stale, with a faint, musty smell that lingered from years of accumulated dust. A small fan whirred quietly in the corner, doing little to dispel the sense of unease that filled the room. I took a deep breath and settled into the chair, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, while the darkness outside seemed to close in around me. I looked at the monitor in front of me, its screen dark and lifeless. I reached over and flicked the switch, and the monitor came to life with a soft hum. The security cameras began to feed live footage onto the screen, each camera view slowly flickering to clarity. The monitors showed static at first, then gradually resolved into the familiar, albeit unsettling, images of the restaurant's various angles. The main dining area appeared empty and forlorn, with tables and chairs scattered in disarray. The arcade games stood still, their once vibrant colors now muted in the dim light. In the top corner of the screen, a live feed of the entrance showed the door I had just come through, its shadowy frame contrasting sharply with the rest of the room. The cameras seemed to capture every corner of the space, though the shifting shadows and occasional glitches in the feed made it difficult to shake the sense of unease. As I scanned through the different camera angles, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The restaurant, usually so full of life and noise, now felt hauntingly empty, and the monitors seemed to magnify the silence that enveloped the place. Sitting in the chair, I tried to relax and let the hours slip by, but time seemed to stretch endlessly. The clock on the wall flashed 12:45, and I turned my attention to the monitors, trying to keep myself occupied. I focused on the stage where the animatronics were supposed to be. The feed from the camera showed the stage in its usual state, still and silent. The animatronics were positioned in their usual spots, motionless in the dim light. But then something caught my eye. The head of the mouse animatronic, Chuck E. Cheese himself seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement that made me question my eyes. The camera angle was distorted by the low light, but it looked as if the head was turning directly towards the lens. My heart dropped into my stomach as I stared at the screen. The eyes of the animatronic, usually vacant and mechanical, seemed to be locked onto the camera with an unsettling intensity. It was as if it was staring right at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of my presence. I blinked, hoping to clear my vision, but when I looked again, the animatronic's head was still turned towards the camera. The eerie gaze seemed to follow me, and I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if something truly strange was happening. The silence of the restaurant felt even heavier now, amplifying the dread that had settled in my chest. Feeling the mounting anxiety, I decided to avoid the cameras, hoping that focusing on something else might calm me down. I grabbed a pencil and paper and began drawing to pass the time. Through I was, trying to distract myself with drawing. The delicate strokes of the pencil were a small comfort against the oppressive darkness of the restaurant. As the hours dragged on, I lost myself in the creative world, but the unease never fully left me. I glanced up occasionally, reassured by the steady movement of my pencil dancing across the paper, and the faint, comforting sensation of whatever I was drawing. Eventually, I checked the time again. It was 2:35 a.m. The realization that several hours had passed made me feel both relieved and more unsettled. The restaurant was even quieter than before, and the silence seemed to weigh heavily on me. I debated checking the cameras again, but a wave of fear washed over me. The thought of facing whatever might be on those screens was daunting, and I wasn't sure I could handle seeing something unsettling again. The fear of what I might see or what I might not see kept me rooted to my seat, the pencil in my hand, offering only a temporary escape from the eerie reality of my surroundings. I knew I had to check the cameras. It was part of my job, no matter how much I dreaded it. Steeling myself, I forced myself to look at the monitors as the feeds flickered to life. A cold shiver ran down my spine. All 4 animatronics were on the stage, their heads turned towards the camera. The familiar robotic figures were now staring directly into the lens with unnervingly lifelike expressions. Their eyes, usually vacant and unseeing, seemed to be following me, and their mechanical features took on a disturbing sense of intent. I whispered a stunned, "What the fuck?" under my breath. The sight was so surreal that it felt like a cruel joke, but the reality of the situation was all too clear. The hairs on my arms and neck stood on end as the eerie stillness of the scene filled me with a deep, unsettling dread. The animatronics just sat there, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking and unmoving. The eerie stillness of their gaze was suffocating, and the longer I stared, the more unnerved I became. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape the oppressive, nightmarish atmosphere of the restaurant and never look back. The thought that these mechanical figures were somehow moving or observing me unnaturally was terrifying. My mind raced with dark possibilities. Could they really be moving on their own? The notion that I might be witnessing something beyond the realm of ordinary fear made my skin crawl. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. Was this my punishment for failing to protect the others? The idea that their deaths, occurring under my watch, might be coming back to haunt me was almost too much to bear. As a security guard, I was supposed to keep everyone safe, but here I was, overwhelmed by the very things I was meant to oversee. The guilt and fear combined, making the thought of staying even more unbearable. I glanced back at the cameras, relieved to see the animatronics had returned to their usual positions, no longer staring directly at the camera. The momentary sense of relief was fleeting, though something nagged at the back of my mind. I quickly realized that something was wrong. There should have been 5 animatronics on stage, but now only 4 were visible. The absence of the mouse animatronic, Chucky, Cheese himself, was unsettling. Where was he? The sight of only 4 figures instead of the usual 5 filled me with a fresh wave of anxiety. The missing animatronic seemed to amplify the eeriness of the situation, and the silence in the restaurant felt even more oppressive. I had to figure out where Chucky was and why he was no longer on stage, but the fear of what I might find made the thought of investigating even more daunting. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen for any sound that might indicate someone or something approaching. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the distant hum of the restaurant's aging equipment. Then, I heard it faint, almost imperceptible footsteps growing closer and closer to my office. Each step seemed to echo louder in my ears, making my heart race uncontrollably. The sound was steady, deliberate, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. I was on high alert, every muscle tensed, ready to bolt at the slightest sign of danger. The money I was making felt insignificant compared to the fear and dread I was experiencing. No amount of cash was worth facing whatever was creeping up to my office. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already in too deep. The voice that echoed through the office was unmistakable. Welcome to Chucky.
Jesus.
Where a kid can be a kid. It sounded eerily like Chucky, Cheese himself, but distorted by the unsettling context. My heart pounded violently in my chest as I remained frouncing in my seat, the sound of the voice chilling me to my core. The footsteps drew nearer, and then I heard the knocking at the door. The rhythmic, Insistent thuds seemed to shake the very walls of the office. I had no intention of answering. The fear was overwhelming. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, and I felt trapped in a nightmare where I couldn't escape. My mind raced as I looked around the office for a place to hide. The room was small and cluttered, with no real cover to speak of. Fortunately, there were 2 doors in the room. If I was cornered, I'd have a chance to flee through the other exit. My hand shook as I planned my escape, knowing that if I needed to, I could use the second door to make a run for it. The creeping dread remained, but the thought of a possible escape route gave me a sliver of hope amidst the terror. After what felt like an eternity of taunting, the door was suddenly and violently smashed open with a single, forceful push. Standing there was a towering, nightmarish figure, its features grotesquely distorted and unsettling. Without a second thought, I bolted from my chair and sprinted towards the exit, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pounding of heavy footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder and more menacing as I ran. Glancing towards the stage, I saw the remaining 4 animatronics staring at me, and one of them was now moving to join in the chase. I burst through the front door of the building, ignoring the terrifying sight behind me. My car was just a few yards away, and I ran straight for it, fumbling with my keys as I struggled to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat, heart pounding and hands shaking, and quickly started the engine. The car roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. As I sped away, the sense of impending danger slowly faded, though the adrenaline still coursed through me. I didn't dare look back, focusing solely on getting as far away from that nightmare as possible. The relief of escaping, even if only temporarily, washed over me, though the memory of that harrowing night would undoubtedly haunt me for a long time. Later that day, the decision was made to demolish the building. The restaurant that had once been a place of joy and laughter was now reduced to rubble. The news of the demolition was almost a relief. The place had become a haunting reminder of the terror I had experienced. I never returned to Chuck E. Cheese's again. The memories of that night and the sight of the animatronics would linger in my mind, and the thought of working there again was unbearable. The restaurant, now just a heap of debris, was a stark symbol of the nightmare that had unfolded, and it was clear that chapter of my life was permanently closed. At 65 years old, I look back on my life with a sense of fulfillment. I dedicated my career to serving as a police officer, and after many years, I've retired with pride, knowing I made a lasting contribution to my community. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this: be the change you wish to see in the world. And remember, when it comes to your children, don't let fear hold them back. Just because one apple is rotten doesn't mean the whole barrel is spoiled. Let them experience the joy of places like Chuck E. Cheese, and trust in the good that still exists in the world. Two years ago, I lost my dad. I don't think he's dead. At least not necessarily. I think it's best I tell you exactly what happened. Maybe then you can give me a solution to the deepening pit of anxiety and guilt within me. My dad reminisced about his hometown a lot. He told me and my sister about how he was an only child raised by traditional parents, and how he would stay outdoors from dawn till dusk, playing with his friends in the woods. His best friend Luke would accompany him on scout missions to the limestone quarry at the center. They'd watch from the upper ring, laying on their bellies, peering down into the spiraling void, sharing a pair of binoculars with one of their eyes each in the adjacent lens, only to be spotted shortly after and chased off the site by security. He was still annoyed about that fact, balling his fists or talking himself out of breath whenever he got to that part in the story. My mum told us about how she met my dad at a summer camp, and how he fell head over heels for her confessing his love after only meeting for a day. Giggling, my mom gave him her family's landline number, which my dad called every day, leaving messages complimenting her or asking about her day. They fell just as hard as each other since they married after a year of dating. This was after my dad's world shattered. He told me and my sister that my grandparents died in a freak accident, as the detective put it. My dad was too young to comprehend the whole thing, and not alone figure out what to do with his inheritance. He never told me and my sister how our grandparents died. I suspected he didn't know. I suspected that he rather wanted to move on and start a new life with my mum than wallow in his own tears in an empty house. They were happy. We were happy. But I think it ate away at him all those years, wondering what happened. It wasn't any surprise that when his childhood home made an appearance in a documentary about abandoned towns, we paid a visit. Why are we going back? Well, that documentary ignited a memory in me that I had long forgotten. There's a time capsule in the woods that me and Luke buried when we were younger. I don't know. I guess just seeing it on the TV like that made me realize that it would never see the light of day again. I think it's only right we're the ones to do it. You'll get to see where your old man came from. He chuckled, punching me lightly on the arm. Say, why do you think this place was abandoned to begin with? The documentary didn't really make much sense. Well, if I had to guess, I suppose it has something to do with the quarry. Limestone isn't as in high demand as it used to be. Suppose it just went bust, and with funding being cut off from the rest of the town, younger folk probably lost hope and left. Good luck convincing your elders that. They likely stayed and the town dwindled down over time to what it is today. A ghost town? What do you think? I thought about his answer for a while, watching the golden wheat fields passing us by. I couldn't argue with him, and I told him that I agreed, punching him back on the arm. It was quiet most of the way, with my mum and sister deciding to stay home. But my dad liked to break the silence every now and again, cranking up the radio and singing along at full volume as we barreled down the dirt road. After 10 hours, we finally passed the welcome sign of Woodburn. My dad's eyes glazed over. Any semblance of excitement or joy of coming back and leaving with it, as the grey wheat stalks came into view. Cracks littered the dry soil, intertwining in hexagonal shapes like that of a fish's scales. The grey clouds rolling overhead, a light downpour of rain, plastered the car's windscreen as we neared the first row of houses, the dense greenery growing larger in the distance. Opposed to the evident signs of drought, the wheat field endured. The village itself had become a botany hive mind. The front lawns were significantly overgrown to the extent that plants began to grow along the side of the house and across the road, leaving natural potholes as they tunneled beneath the tarmac. The plants will be getting a nice drink. My dad chimed, trying to bring the atmosphere back to normal as the rain started to pick up. The low hum of the engine was the background music to our scouting mission as we crawled through the streets, taking our time to avoid the stray roots that tunneled beneath the road. As we turned the third corner, a car came into view, held in mid-flip by thick veins that knotted around themselves, enhancing the thickness to an impossible scale that seemingly attempted to prevent the car from crashing down on a patch of newly sprouted stems. Impressive what plants can do when left on their own, ain't it? I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat as we slowly passed the wreck. Continuing down the street, we turned onto a road that passed along the town square. The engine suddenly cut out, with my dad clutching the keys in his hand as he stepped out of the car. You kidding me?
Alex gets out here.
It's the town hall. I stepped out of the car, my dad already skipping over to the building without waiting for me. Slowly following him, I was rooted to the spot, taking in the spectacle before me. A Gothic masterpiece made entirely out of limestone, arches and pillars failing not to make the viewer think of the architectural genius of the Roman Empire, now long forgotten with the earth taking it back. Vines wrapped tightly around each of the pillars, leaving fissures and cracks for more to take root, with the arrow-headed leaves making it appear as if the building underwent a siege. As I entered the building, I found my dad already rummaging in a stack of drawers, taking out papers and pens and examining them eagerly. The vines had already gained entry to the interior, wrapping around the wooden chairs, leaving some suspended and twisted in the air. This isn't what caught my attention. However, written on the board at the center of the stage were the crossed-out words, "Fire."
Chemical.
Blockage with the uncrossed word, "Manual," beneath them. Hey, Dad, what's that? I said, pointing at the stage. My dad turned his head, following my finger, locking eyes with the words, with a confused look across his face before taking a short intake of breath to scoff. It's probably a last-ditch effort to revitalize the quarry. Some sort of training program. I didn't quite agree with him, but with no argument to suggest otherwise or opinion of my own, I lightly shook my head, which he took as a sign of respect, as a smile beamed across his face. Come on, let's get that time capsule. We're not far now. Brushing past my shoulder, his footsteps echoing around the room as I turned to follow him. Left, straight, right, and then another sharp left turn straight in the middle of a path as my dad turned to face a thick bramble of leaves and thorns. Smiling, he began folding and twisting his body around the branches, scraping his arms a couple of times with a light trickle of blood forming at the back of his arms. I stood hesitantly observing the path he created, vaguely making out the blue sign, "Public Footpath," lodged within. Breathing a heavy sigh, I embraced the orchestra of yelps and moans, advancing in pursuit of the rose-tinted memories my dad held onto. By the time I made it through, he was already on his hands and knees, scraping away fistfuls of soil, revealing a large tangle of intermingled root systems beneath that were shown no mercy as he yanked and severed their connections. Burying his hands further, his elbows mere centimeters from being submerged, he finally revealed a small black box as he began dusting away the grit with his hands. "Alex, come look at this," he shouted in pure excitement, his laughter bellowing out through the trees. He opened the box, rifling through countless pictures of him and his friends, holding them up to me for my approval before burying his face back into the box, taking out figurines and playing cards. "Pretty cool, Dad," I said almost mockingly. You wouldn't get it. This stuff is rare these days. If you had any idea." "Hello." Both spinning around in the dirt, we stood face to face with a teenage girl who looked around my age. She had short, curly brown hair with a few stray leaves, which had become caught, making it look like a bird's nest. She wore a blue flannel shirt and skinny jeans, both caked in mud, along with her brown boots, which had become worn down by the rough terrain as leaves and stems hung aloft the many tiers. "You scared us," my dad laughed breathlessly. "Are you from Woodburn too?" The girl slowly nodded, the leaves bouncing a little with the sudden movement. "Us too. We're just stopping by so I can show my son where I came from," he said, patting my shoulder reassuringly. The woman didn't respond as she continued staring at us with her green, gloopy eyes. My dad went to speak before a rustle of leaves came from behind, averting our attention to our newest intruder. Mom." My dad froze, sweat trickling down his forehead, his legs shaking. An elderly woman emerged from the leaves wearing a white cardigan, brown trousers, and green wellies showing the same evident signs of wear and tear as the other women. Her pale, thin skin stretched tight across her bones, her pulsing veins stuck out prominently, the sunlight above making them appear a light green. She began stepping towards my dad, her arms outstretched, ready to embrace him. My dad, on the other hand, was a puddle of snot and tears, his constant trembling causing the box in his hands to rattle unendingly. Only a foot away from us now, the tightness of her skin around her skull had become more visible, each shadow further sinking her features as they started to ripple and contort too, her parting lips as long, thick vines plummeted out of her mouth, entwining themselves, with the roots below pulling her face down to the earth as she endeavored to advance. Her speed unfaltering, the vines were pulled tight against the roots as her skin began to tear, the dark red flesh poking from beneath, only to be overcome by more and more vines, snapping out from her unhinged jaw, releasing a putrid stench that stung my eyes, making my head spin until I couldn't take it and vomited directly onto her. My heart was racing, my eyes bulging. My mouth felt sapped of moisture as I lost control of my body, and my legs took me further into the woods, the screams of my father echoing behind. Tears streamed down my face, blinding my vision. I tore through a bramble of thorns skidding across the gravel and rolling to a stop just before the edge. Wiping my eyes, my heart pounding in my ears, my stomach sank as I gazed out at the open quarry, its many levels spiraling down to a bottomless void. My hand shooting up to cover my nose. The smell of rot and spoiled vegetables invaded my senses as I spun my head blindly looking for the source. Slumped against a tree trunk was a thick entanglement of vines and leaves, the wet bone jutting out from within. The vines had completely taken over their body, twisting themselves into a dizzying effect, replacing the spilled-out intestines as more saplings took root, pinning them to the ground as buds started to flower across the protruding ribcage into a thick array of petals that dug into their sockets in an explosion of vibrant colors. I gagged and heaved at the sight, my body unable to find anything else to throw up. Stumbling to my knees, I knocked something, sending it skidding across the gravel, my head raising to see as a plastic blue miner's helmet come into view. I couldn't take it. People say that you don't know whether you're a flight, or freeze until you have faced a situation where your mind physically can't comprehend what you are seeing and senses immediate danger. I'm flight, a cowardly waste of space that left his dad in that place with those things. I ran and I ran, and I ran stumbling over branches and vines and roots. I didn't come across anyone else in those woods. When I made it back to civilization, I came across some friendly strangers willing to lend a hand. I made a report to rescue services about my dad, and they told me they conducted an aerial search, but that they couldn't see anything through the greenery. They told me countless times that they were looking, but I knew they were all lies. I think they knew what had taken over that town, and they were too ashamed to accept responsibility. And who am I to judge? I ran away from my dad. I think about him a lot, especially now. This morning I came across something in my garden. I came across the arrow-headed leaves of that god-forsaken town. I don't know what to do, and I'm terrified. I tried digging it up, but it came back tonight, and it's grown even more. I've been sitting on this one for a little while, but I think it's time. This happened about 3 years ago. I was, without a doubt, the worst kind of hiker. You know, those guys who are all leave no sign, bagging their garbage, burying their poop, cleaning up their campsite, respecting nature's natural beauty, and all that. Yeah, that wasn't me. I like camping. My parents liked camping, but there was always a mentality of the woods will take care of things. I watched my dad leave a whole cooler full of empty beer cans at the site one time when I was 8. We brought a couch with us on a camping trip once just because Dad knew there was a ravine nearby. Broken fishing rods, left by the creek. Garbage, right on the ground. Hell, we left a whole tent once because Dad couldn't get it back in the bag. We didn't use campgrounds either. Dad and Mom would pack up and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just live off the land for a couple of days, and then leave their crap behind. I can't say that this is why I am the way I am. I know better than to litter and be a pig. But in my head, the woods will always just take care of themselves. It's been here for millions of years. Why is my trash and stuff going to mess with that? If my styrofoam cooler kills a couple of trees, then they didn't deserve to be there. Right. That was what I thought, at least. I go camping about 3 times a year. The start of spring, the start of summer, and the end of summer. I live in California, so I always just pack up my pickup, get some food and beer and recreational greenery, and head out to somewhere remote. A buddy of mine from work hadn't shut up about this overlook about an hour from the city, right outside the Santa Lucia mountain range, and I figured I'd go crash out there for a weekend. Unlike my parents, I am not a living off the land kind of person. I brought food, I brought stuff, and I intended to do nothing but sit in the wilderness, sleep in my hammock, and get high. I called out Friday and found the perfect spot by lunchtime. It was gorgeous, overlooking the valley and so remote that if I were to get really hurt, I'd probably die out here with no one the wiser. I set up my hammock, set out my fire logs, got some water, just in case, and just kind of spread out a bit. I made some lunch, sandwiches, rolled a joint, and just kind of got mellow for a bit as the day rolled on. It was nice out here, just watching the clouds and listening to nature. I was soon pretty well lit, and as the sun started creeping down, I set about lighting my fire. There was probably a burn ban in effect, but I had water and I didn't care. Out here, no one was going to see me anyway, and I started roasting hot dogs as the sun cut a fantastic line across the sky. That was the first time I noticed them. I remember looking up and whispering shit as I mistook them for rangers or cops or something. They were just silhouettes on the ridge not far from my camp, 3 or 4 of them, and they had these wide, flat-topped hats like park rangers or the guy on the oatmeal box. I watched them for a minute, thinking I was busted, but they just stood there. They didn't move. They didn't call out. But I know they saw me. My fire had to be visible for a ways at this height, and the longer they stayed there, the more creeped out I felt. Why were they just standing there? If they wanted me to leave, then why not tell me to leave? I didn't know, but once the sun set, I noticed they had vanished and just kind of kept an eye peeled. I had my gun, a big old .45, so I wasn't worried, but I suddenly wished I had a tent to sleep in instead of just a hammock. I sparked up again after eating a pack of dogs, though, and that took care of any thoughts of shadow guys or whatever. I dozed off in my hammock, but I dreamed about them that night too. I dreamed that they were in my campsite, just standing around and watching me. They were like the outlines of people, like when someone stands in front of the sun and all you get is a burnt-out image of them. They didn't have any features, no eyes or anything, and I was frownsome there as they looked at me. They didn't say anything. They just watched me, and it felt like being sleep paralyzed the whole night. I woke up after dawn, almost fell out of my hammock, and started making breakfast as I stirred up the ashes of last night's fire. I wondered if it had really been a dream or not, but I felt like it must have been. Why would they come and look but not say anything? All my stuff was there, too, down to the hot dog wrapper I'd left on the ground next to the fire, and I tossed it in absent-mindedly as I ate my eggs and ham. The ice was still holding out. It was spring and not too hot yet, so I decided to go on a forest pub crawl today. Translation: I put a bunch of beer into my backpack and walked out into the woods so I could have a drunk hike. I spent about 5 hours hiking in the woods, tossing my dead soldiers into the trees as I finished them. Some of them broke. Most of them didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me as I hiked in the woods. I never saw anything. It wasn't like I spotted someone hiding behind a tree, but it was like deep pockets of shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was midday, the sun was high, and I should have had major visibility. Even so, I found myself looking around as the crawling feeling just got worse and worse. Some of it was being drunk in the hot woods with no water, and when I found a stream, I plunged my face in to get a little clarity. I drank a little. Dad always said running water was fine to drink from, and when something snapped not far from me, I looked up like a zebra at a watering hole. I looked around, trying to find what was stalking me. There was nothing, just the quiet forest and the gently rushing stream. No, I didn't believe that. I had felt stalked all day, and as I watched the trees, I felt sure that something moved out there. I got up and started running, the zebra analogy too hard to break, and I kept waiting for the claws to sink in, the teeth to bite, and the hot breath to fall on my neck. It was going to come at any minute. I could feel it, and when I tripped over a fallen log, I just lay there and waited for the end. It would get me now. It would get me and I'd be dead. I'd be dead. Nothing happened. I lay there for nearly 10 minutes, just knowing it would get me when I moved, but it never came. When the ants started to bite my legs, I sat up and swiped at them. I had fallen next to an ant bed that I had accidentally stomped on in my haste, and they were mad as hell about it. I ended up going back to the creek to wash them off, a haphazard trip that took another 10 minutes, and I was still looking around like a scared animal. I sat with my legs in the creek until they stopped throbbing, and then made my miserable way back to camp. It was not as much fun walking back as it had been walking out. and I was jittery and tense the whole way. The sun was starting to slip down, and I absolutely didn't want to be out here when it got dark. Too many things could be crunching around out here in the dark. I made it back to camp before it got dark, and as I cooked my dinner, the sun started to ride low again. It was more hot dogs tonight, cooked over the fire, but I couldn't finish all of them. I was too scared to look away from the ridge, and I ended up burning more than one of them. They tasted fine either way, but I had eyes only for the shadows on the ridge. They had the same wide-brimmed hats. A few of them had canes, but none of them were really people. They were like shadows. The burned images at Hiroshima, the photo negatives that sometimes get burned into old photographs. All of them at once, and none of them at all. They just stood there, watching me. They didn't move. They didn't stir. And as the sun sank, I became colder and colder. I should have gone to my truck and left. But I didn't. I made myself put it out of my mind. I convinced myself that I was being foolish. When it got dark, I got in my hammock and tried to get comfortable, but it wouldn't come. My leg hurt. I was sunburnt. I was hungover. I was dehydrated. But ultimately I was afraid. I was afraid that when I closed my eyes, they would get me. I was afraid they would just carry me off in the night and I would never be seen again. They would find my truck and my campsite, but never me. Maybe, I thought as I finally nodded off, someone would look up one afternoon at sunset and see me on that ridge, just watching. I must have fallen asleep, and I like to think I dreamed what came next. I want to, but I can't convince myself that I did. I woke up and saw them standing around me. I could see them, and not just the ones in front of the fire. They were darker than the night somehow, and they began to creep closer to me. Crept is the wrong word, though. They slid along the ground like the ghosts in some of the horror movies I'd watched as a kid. They hemmed me in, my body shaking but my voice stuck in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare speak. And as they knelt around me, I heard whispering. It was a terrible sound, and it follows me into sleep sometimes. You come here to the womb of creation and leave your waste. You are a brainless creature fit only to destroy things made by your betters. You burn the wood of a creature who has existed before you were more than a twinkling in your father's eye. You destroy a place that was new when this planet cooled. You throw your trash into a home shared by 100 billion organisms, and you claim to be the superior here, the better. You are nothing, and you will die and be forgotten. On and on and on. They whispered endlessly to me, telling me how worthless I was, how I was a nuisance and a nothing, and how I would never change. Then, one of them rose up over my hammock, his body seeming to hang over me like a shadow cast from above. He looked like them, but he was clearly their boss or something. And when he brought the cane down on nothing but air, I heard it crack like a thunderbolt. Go back to your stinking pit, but be warned. The next time you come to our woods and ruin our place, you will not be allowed to scamper off so easily. You are a stunted thing who was taught badly, but ignorance is forgivable if you persist in this folly. However, we will not be so kind again. Now go, it yelled, and I opened my eyes to find that it was morning. I was laying in my hammock, piss dribbling down my leg, and I knew that I better not be here when the sun set again. I cleaned up everything. I picked up all my garbage. I cleaned up the site. I poured water over the fire and mixed it with dirt like they always say to on TV, and then I took everything with me and ran for the truck. That was Sunday, and I've been kind of afraid to leave my apartment. What if they are waiting out there for me? What if they find me slipping or don't like that I don't recycle or something like that? What if I offend them and they drag me back to the woods to be punished? That's part of why I'm writing this. If you're like me, someone who doesn't care about their mess or just leaves the woods wrecked, then watch out. Don't let the Dark Watchers catch you messing up their forest, because they do more than just watch. Don't let them see you slipping, or you might find out what sort of punishment awaits those who anger them. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.